Okay, I'm going to zoom this in a little bit so we can see the screen better. Okay, so the first thing we're going to go over today is our essay. Sorry. First thing we're going to go over today is our essay coming up, Historical Application Essay 2. Just to talk a little bit about some of the essays I saw over this last week when I was grading them. Most of them were very good. A lot of you followed MLA format. There are some students who, they followed mostly MLA format, but there was about 3 or 4 things that weren't right. They might have forgotten a page numbering, they might have forgotten a heading order or a spacing issue. Try to be careful with those because they can cost you a bit of a grade. If they're really bad, they can cost you an entire letter grade. Alright, so another thing I noticed with the Historical Application 1 is there were a couple students, maybe 3 or 4 actually, who they kind of were on a prompt, but not really. So remember what I said, it's okay to like mix and match a little bit of this as long as you're on the prompt question. But I had a few students who, for example, wrote about, it was talking about how should we look back at colonial period, the colonial times, and then that student just kind of talked about just history in general. It wasn't really part of the topic. So be careful when you pick a topic, make sure you are staying on the topic question because again, that can cost you a letter grade. A third thing I saw to be careful for both students here and students over on the camera there, when you're using sources, make sure that you don't just use the minimum amount of sources because that's what the instructions say. Always use however many citations you need based on the claims you make. So just because you use the minimum amount of sources does not guarantee you're going to get a good grade. That's just the minimum. So if you make, say, 2 or 3 claims in your paragraph from different authors or even from the same author, you need to make sure you're citing in those big paragraphs. A fourth thing that I want to talk about, block quotes. So if you have a quote that is longer than 3 lines, you need to put it in the form of a block quote. This is an MLA feature. You can look it up on the Purdue Owl website for how to do it. It's very easy, but this lets me know that that is just a quote that's long. If you just put in quotations, technically it's not correct MLA format. So you got to be careful with that. Also, suggestion number 5, I'm going to go through a list of these just to help you out with the papers. Suggestion number 5, I see a lot of students using a lot of quotes for most of their paper. Remember what I said about it last time is that really I'd like to see more paraphrasing than quotes. It's okay to use a lot of sources, that's always good, but paraphrasing means it's more your wording. And if you pad the paper with a lot of quotations, it's really not so much your paper as a paper made up of quotes. And that can also be a letter grade deduction. 6 or 7 thing, whatever number I'm on. When you submit your paper, and I caught at least 5 or 6 students doing this, make sure you submit fully. I know that some of you had an error with the submission. If that happens, send me an email, let me know, I'll reopen it. That can happen, but just make sure that it is submitted fully because you'll click the submit button and it'll say like submitted or submission ready, and then you think I've done it. You need to make sure it is completely confirmed that submission all the way through. That way, if for any reason I do not grade it, you can actually send me a snippet and say, hey, this told me I did it, and then I'll go and fix it. That's just me making sure I'm on par with that. I'm trying to think, is there anything else that I want to cover for papers? Or for the time being, no, but just keep those things on idea on the list. If for any reason you're concerned about a grade, like if you see a grade, you're like, I'm not understanding why I got that, I usually leave comments, like both in the discussions and the papers, you will see comments either on the paper sheet, on the rubric, or in your grade slot, so you'll actually see a comment left behind. So if for any reason you've got a question, check the comments first, and if you still don't understand, send me an email and we'll get it worked out. Any questions? No? Okay, so let's talk about historical application number 2. The good news is this is the only other paper you'll have to do in this class, so yay! Once you're done with that, you won't have to do any more really hard, extensive writing apart from discussions. Okie dokie. Yep, so welcome to essay number 2. A few reminders to get you started. Let's move down a bit. Alright, so this pretty much follows the same pattern as essay number 1. We'll go over this. 1, your essay should be at minimum structurally sound. You need an introduction, thesis statement is the last sentence, 2 or more body paragraphs, a clear topic, and a conclusion that introduces no new ideas or evidence. So this actually reminds me of something else I want to talk about on that list. When there's again about 3 or 4 students I caught when they wrote their paragraphs, they ended their introduction paragraph with a question. It's a thesis statement, not a thesis question. So it's okay to begin your introduction with a question. I don't particularly like it myself, but I'm not going to dock you for that. But your thesis, your introduction paragraph, the first paragraph should always end with a clear thesis statement. That is telling the reader what you're going to be talking about and what your assertion is. So make sure that you don't end it in a question and in a statement. All right. So again, second thing says that you must have a thesis statement and not simply a topic statement. So that's another thing I want to talk about. A thesis statement is an assertion you're making, like George Washington was the cause of the First World War. That's a thesis statement. You're asserting something. Versus George Washington was involved in the First World War. That's a basic fact. It's not really a thesis so much as a topic. So make sure that you're making a directed point. All right, you must prove your points by using evidence and citations from your studies rather than just asserting them. You must cite at least once from your lecture and once from your book to be eligible to receive full credit. Keep in mind, that doesn't mean you will receive full credit. That's just the bare minimum. All right, your essay should be between 500 and 600 words long. We've already gone over that. I think almost every student pretty much had that, so that one's not concerning me. Make sure you're not under 500, and if you go over 600, try to keep it as close as the mark as possible. Your paper must be submitted in PDF format. Again, most of the students follow this. It's the link in the course. Do not email your paper unless there's a technical error. So I got some emails from students saying, hey, I'm just going to email you this. I can't take it. I mean, like, I appreciate that you've got it and you're sending it, but just let me know that I need to reopen the course for you. With this second essay, and I'm going to send a warning to this class here and the people watching. Second essay. Now that you kind of know how to submit the essays, if the essay is submitted late, you can still send an email, but there will be a late grade deduction. So I'd say about 10 points. So it could be a letter grade, depending on the situation. If you did submit it and it just didn't go through, and I see that you tried to submit it, that's different, because I realized that you did try to send it and it just for whatever there's an error. But if you just simply did not send it, that's unfortunately on you. Okay, so keep in mind, we're about to go over the topic list. If you want to write about a topic not listed, email me. If I think it is relevant, I will let you do it. So don't be afraid to go outside the topic list, but you gotta check and be like, hey, Mr. Belcher, I'm not really feeling anything here. You need to pick a topic specifically about this form of history, this period of history that you want to discuss. If you want to talk about the Civil War, if you want to talk about a battle and how it related to, I don't know, slavery, something like that, feel free, but let me know first and make sure I confirm it. All right, so here are some of the topics that you can pick, and I really, really like some of these topics. I think these are going to be a little bit more fun than the first ones. Okay, was America founded as a Christian nation, and what has changed since its founding? This is a really, really good one, especially with what we've been talking about with kind of the founding fathers. Were they all Christians? Did they at least respect the Christian ideology? While we're thinking about it, let's talk about it in class. So who wants to chime in on this? What do they think the answer to this question is?
Well, yeah. Most of them, like at least half of them are deists,
yep.
But it is based on like Christian fundamentals, so like morals, you know?
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely right. So that's actually a really good one to position on, is that many of the founding fathers weren't directly Christian, at least not in the most traditional sense, but they did believe in the Christian Judeo ideals. They also believed in Greco-Roman ideals. Anyone else want to chime in on this one?
It was technically founded as they wanted it to be a Christian nation, but our founders were not Christian.
Okay. So in other words, like, ideally it was founded as a Christian nation, but it didn't necessarily follow through that way. That's a good position, yeah. So what has changed since we've founded this nation, in your minds?
We've become a lot more diverse.
That is certainly true. You know, so that's one, especially in the realm of belief, because originally, when you look back at our colonial period, even though not everyone was necessarily Christian, there really wasn't any question what the general consensus was, that this, we believed in Christianity. Even if we weren't directly Christian, we believed in Christian ideals. But that has since changed. Really, two of the eras that really changed it were the 1920s, and 1960s. You saw some major radical movements that altered and shifted the balance of religion as a role in our society. So that's another thing to consider. So if you want to actually cover this and cover some modern period stuff, you can do that, provided you have sources for it. All right, so was the Constitution the best document for the U.S. founding period?
I mean, it did bring a lot lot of controversy though.
It's true, and we go back to the dilemma of the Declaration. The Declaration and the Constitution. The Constitution still did not fully address slavery, would not address slavery until the 13th Amendment, which is during the Civil War, during Abraham Lincoln's presidency. So, could it have been improved at the time? Do you think that we could have done a better job? Or do you think that the current, or I should say the status that it was made was good for the time?
I think it was good for the time.
It was good for the time? Okay.
Even like then there were two parties who would argue over whether or not it should the Constitution should like strictly be followed,
Mm-hmm.
or if it's kind of like
A set of guidelines?
yeah.
Yeah. And even to this day, you could argue there's two sides, and I don't mean just right and left. I mean there are people on two different sides of the Constitution. Some who believe it does need to be amended or changed in various ways, and others who are very, very beholden to it, and they believe, no, the Constitution is what it is. We should adhere to it. It is our law. And I mean, that's a really, really hot topic, especially today. All right, should a nation have stayed with the Articles of Confederation?
I don't know enough about it, but I don't think so.
Probably not. I mean, you can take the position that they should have, but remember, the Articles of Confederation was like diet constitution. Basically, it was the diet constitution. It really did not have the same ingredients and the same forethought that the Constitution did. The Constitution was much more detailed. The Articles of Confederation left a lot of positions out and stuff. So this is one that I think will be a very fun topic. And again, you have really good sources with Melton and Johnson for this one. It's going to be an easy one. All right, which is more important to American history? The Constitution or the Declaration of Independence? This is another really good one.
Probably the Declaration of Independence.
Okay, in y'all's mind, why?
Mostly because it's the very first, like, actual document that they signed as, as a nation.
Mm-hmm. So it was kind of the first indication of what the nation was about.
Mm-hmm.
Could you make an argument that the Constitution was more important? Yeah. Why?
Especially because we use it today. People like to back it up. There are
Yep.
things by saying this amendment says this, you know.
Right, so you could argue the Constitution is more, at the very least, more relevant to today because of the fact that we still adhere to its laws. It is technically the law of the land. So either one, you can take either position. If you can back it out. All right, I love this number 4, and we're going to get into a little bit of that. Andrew Jackson, we might watch the video today, but Andrew Jackson, need I say more? So pick what you want about Andrew Jackson. Again, don't be biased. Don't go, Andrew Jackson, just a jerk. No. Actually come up with something with Andrew Jackson, like was he a good president, was he a great military leader, or maybe compare it. That's actually one suggestion here, is compare Andrew Jackson, the military leader, to Andrew Jackson, the president, and maybe do like a compare-contrast position. He is a very, very fascinating historical figure who is full of controversy. You could even relate him to, say, the Trail of Tears, or even just Native Americans if you want to do that. There's so much you can do with Jackson. Okay, now, I want to talk about this question a little bit because we had a student last year who made this mistake, and I want to emphasize this. All right, when this question says which is better, a democratic or Republican form of government, it is not asking who's better, the Democrats or the Republicans. That's not what this question is asking. It is asking, is a democracy, which came from Greek ideals, a direct democracy where people have the power, a better form of government, or is a republic where we elect representatives to represent us and vote for us, a better form of government? If you have to, or if I had to ask, what are we really more of? A republic, yes. We are actually officially, I believe, a federal republic. I think is what you call us. Some say a democratic republic. Do we have some democratic ideals and practices?
Yeah.
Absolutely. We have a right to vote. We have a say. We have a voice. But I just want to doubly emphasize that this is not asking about which political party is better. It's asking which form of government is better. I had to dock a student last year because the student literally was like, well, the Democrats are blah, 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 and terrible, blah, and the Republicans are like, that's not what this was asking about at all. So be careful with this question if you pick it. All right, evaluate Thomas Jefferson as a leader, politician, or person. Or, you know what, all three. Actually, if you want to actually do like a leader for one paragraph, politician, and a person in each paragraph, that's a really good approach. And I mean, again, Jefferson is so controversial. I love Jefferson as a historical figure, but let's be fair, he changed his mind a lot, and often changed it when it suited him more. He was pretty much the quintessential American politician. So this is definitely a really good one to pick, and again, you have loads of sources, very easy topic to write about. Okay, this one, again, very controversial question. Was real compromise over slavery possible? So in other words, what compromise had the best chance of working, and why did they all fail? The ones that they tried to make, why did they fail? So in other words, do you think that it would have been possible to end slavery in a peaceful way, or was war the only solution? Was it going to come to war? Was it inevitable? This is a really good topic, but I'll be honest, a real controversial one. You got to try to avoid the biases on this one. Make sure you have lots of sources for that, or at least a lot of backing. Is there a public moral sin today comparable to slavery in the 19th century? We may actually talk about this next weekend, I think. The main question this is talking, or the main issue this is talking about is slavery, and can anyone guess? There is one that is essentially a form of slavery today, still being done even in our country. Sadly.
Sex trafficking?
Trafficking.
Yeah.
Human trafficking. Yep. So basically human trafficking is just another modern way of saying slavery, and essentially people are kidnapped, sold, and bought by people and used for all sorts of horrible things. That's still going on today. It still even goes on in our own state. Like Atlanta's a major front for it. And essentially what's happening is young women, particularly, sometimes young gentlemen, but usually young women, are being kidnapped off the streets and forced into servitude of some kind. It occurs all over the world. It is still occurring today. So I'll tell you what, again, very controversial topic, but a very current one that you could actually address. Okay, and another one here is, in what ways did slavery change in America over time? This is another one where you could either adopt human trafficking as like a modern form of it, or you could just talk about slavery during the colonial and the 19th century periods. Did slavery get better or worse between the colony, between 18th century to 19th century? To help you out with this one, I'll give you 2 words: cotton gin. Cotton gin. So if you know what I'm talking about, this is about Eli Whitney's, who mentioned the cotton gin. So one of the assertions by the Founding Fathers, which was not entirely off base, was that slavery would simply die out. It would just kind of lose its edge, because by the founding of America and after the Revolutionary War, slavery was on its way to being abolished in the British Empire. It was actually abolished by, well, it wasn't fully abolished, but it was abolished under the efforts of William Wilberforce. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Amazing Grace. But he's a very, very cool historical figure, British MP, and his mentor slash friend was John Newton, who was actually at one point a slave trader, and his ship was in a storm, and he prayed to God. He had never prayed to God before. He prayed to God, please save me, blah, 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 and the storm stopped. So John Newton became a Christian and started becoming an abolitionist. He went against the slave trade and wrote the hymn Amazing Grace. So that's actually where all that comes from. William Wilberforce was the main political head behind getting rid of the slave trade and abolishment. So by this point, slavery really was starting to die out in the modern civilized world. But unfortunately, we had a little invention come around called the cotton gin, which made cotton much easier to process and actually made it much more productive and lucrative. And so in the South, money was money, and so slavery started to do this, and then immediately shot way, way up. And in the 19th century, the 1800s, it got much worse. So that's a good topic to talk about. You could, I don't know, you might be able to change this one around. Again, you'd have to check with me on this, but if you wanted to address how slavery led to the Civil War, I'd allow that too. If you want to talk about in relation to the Civil War, you can do that. All right, any questions on these topics? Good. Okay, so now we're going to watch a very exciting and positive video about slavery. I mean, never mind, it's going to be negative and sad. So, how can you ever watch a positive video about slavery? Except that it's over. That's good, I guess. Alright, so let's go ahead and turn the lights off, and then we'll start this crash course on slavery. And yes, I know this is a terrible part of our history, but it is a part of our history. We do need to discuss it. So, here we go.
Great, this is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about slavery, which is not funny. Yes, we're going to lay on the eagle to try to cheer you up, but let's face it, this is going to be depressing. With slavery, every time you think like, oh, it couldn't have been that bad, it turns out to have been much worse. Mr. Green, what about me for the best? I'm going to stop you right there because you're going to embarrass yourself. Slavery was hugely important to America. I mean, it led to a civil war, and it also lasted what, at least in U.S. history, counts as a long-ass time, from 1619 to 1865. And yes, I know there's a 1,200-year-old church in your neighborhood in Denmark, but we're not talking about Denmark. Slavery is most important because we still its legacy. So yes, today's episode will probably not be funny, but it will be important. So the slave-based economy in the South is sometimes characterized as having been separate from the market revolution, but that's not really the case. Without Southern cotton, the North wouldn't have been able to industrialize, at least not as quickly, because cotton textiles were one of the first industrially produced products and the most important commodity in world trade by the 19th century. And 3/4 of the world's cotton came from the American South. And speaking of cotton, why has no one mentioned to me that my collar has been half popped this entire episode, like I'm trying to recreate the flying
So
nuts?
I want to go over what you said. So 3/4 of the world's cotton came from the South. What does that mean for the South? Lots of money. Loads of money. That was their economy.
And although there were increasingly fewer slaves in the North as northern states outlawed slavery, cotton shipments overseas made northern merchants rich, northern bankers financed the purchase of land for plantations, northern insurance companies insured slaves who were, after all, considered...
Okay, so in other words, the North just wanted to get rid of all slaves, right? Because, obviously they couldn't make any money off the South, right? Or could they? What was he just saying here? A lot of people were making money in the North off of Southern production. So at this time, believe it or not, the abolition movement in the North was actually quite small. Most people in the North either, not want to say supported slavery, but they either didn't care or didn't really try hard enough to really say, oh, we need to get rid of slavery. There were small abolition groups popping up at this time, but until the 1860s, until the right pre-Civil War around there, you don't see these heavy abolition movements really taking root yet because, quite frankly, again, money is money. So as long as the North is making some money, as long as the South is making some money, why address the slave question? I mean, it helps us, right? So, go ahead.
Why couldn't they have just hired workers?
Because what do workers cost? Money. See, if you have to pay workers a full salary to work, that costs you. But if you can take a person and label them not a person and then use them as cattle, you don't have to pay cattle. So, and as terrible as that is, that's kind of the attitude they took. So.
Property and very valuable property, and in addition to turning cotton into cloth for sale overseas, northern manufacturers sold cloth back to the South where it was used to clothe the very slaves who had cultivated it. But certainly the most prominent effects of the slave-based economy were seen in the South. The profitability of slave-based agriculture, especially cane cotton, meant that the South would remain largely agricultural and rural. Slave states were home to a few cities like St. Louis and Baltimore, but with the exception of New Orleans, almost all southern urbanization took place in the upper South, further away from the large cotton plantation. And slave-based agriculture was so profitable that it siphoned money away from other economic endeavors. Like there was very little industry in the South. It produced only 10% of the nation's manufactured goods. And as most of the capital was being plowed into the purchase of slaves, there was very little room for technological innovation, like for instance, railroad. This lack of industry and railroads would eventually make the South suck at the Civil War, thankfully. In short, slavery dominated the South, shaping it both economically and culturally. And slavery wasn't a minor aspect of American society. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the U.S., and in the South, they made up 1/3 of the total population. Although in the popular imagination, most plantations were these sprawling affairs with hundreds of slaves, in reality, the majority of slaveholders owned 5 or fewer slaves. And of course, most white people in the South owned no slaves at all, although if they could afford to, they would sometimes rent slaves to help with their work.
I'll put a caveat on that. So, one of the things I will say about slaves, even though you didn't usually have to pay them a regular salary, at least not a legit one, they were still expensive. You had to spend a lot of money on them. One slave was like, gosh, in terms of like pricing, could be equal to like a number of horses. Could be, it was like buying cattle essentially. So buying slaves was still expensive, but the lucrative, return of money was for them very worth it.
Women farmers who lived self-sufficiently, raised their own food, and purchased very little in the market economy. They worked the poorest land, and as a result, were mostly pretty poor themselves. So even they largely supported slavery, partly perhaps for aspirational reasons, and partly because the racism inherent to the system gave even the poorest whites legal and social status. And Southern intellectuals worked hard to encourage these ideas of white solidarity and to make the case for slavery. Many of the founders, a bunch of whom you'll remember held slaves, saw slavery as a necessary evil. Jefferson once wrote, quote, "As it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other."
So he was actually quoting, I'm trying to remember which senator. This senator was always a moderate. He was always in between. I want to say it was Cicero. I think it was Cicero. But anyway, basically what this excuse is well, we can't do anything, but we can't not do anything. We should just kind of keep it status quo because we don't want to take anybody off. And I think it was Pompey who replied to Cicero, he was like, well, maybe you should just want us to climb a tree and run, you know? So in other words, he was mocking this, saying this is a coward's way out. He's like, well, we don't want to attack it, but we don't really want to, defend it either. So in other words, do nothing.
Belief that justice and self-preservation couldn't sit on the same side of the scale was really opposed to the American idea, and in the end, it would make the Civil War inevitable. But as slavery became more entrenched and as ideas of liberty and political equality were embraced by more people, some Southerners began to make the case that slavery wasn't just a necessary evil. They argued, for instance, that slaves benefited from slavery because, their masters fed them and clothed them and took care of them in their old age. You still hear this argument today, astonishingly. In fact, you probably see asshats in the comments.
I will say, while this argument is completely silly, it is true that some slave owners did actually treat their slaves exceedingly well. Like, they let them live in the house, they treated them like family, but the simple fact is they were still what? Slaves. They were still property. And it was like owning a pet at that point. It was like, well, it's my pet, I can do what I want with it. It still was not a status of equality, it was not a station in which they were happy. Now, what would often happen is one or two of the Africans that would come over would be made house slaves. So they were there was like a hierarchy system, and the house slave was at the top of the rest of the slaves. That created a major dynamic of anger between them because essentially these slaves would be treated as better than the rest, and so essentially it was not a good dynamic. Those people would be in between people who were treating the slaves, but also their own people who hated them for being essentially higher end. And yeah, that was another issue. So there was never a sense of true equality here.
Let's say that I will remind you, it's not cursing if you are referring to an actual ass. As paternalism allowed masters to see themselves as benevolent and to contrast their family-oriented slavery with the cold, mercenary capitalism of the free labor North. So yeah, in the face of rising criticism of slavery, some Southerners began to argue that the institution was actually good for the social order. One of the best-known proponents of this view was John C. Calhoun, who in 1837 said this in a speech on the Senate floor: "I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, the relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good." Now, of course, John C. Calhoun was a fringe politician and nobody took his views particularly seriously.
Well, he was Secretary of State from 1844 to 1845.
Well, I mean, who really cares about the Secretary of State, Stan?
He was also Secretary of War from 1817 to 1825.
Alright, but we don't even have a Secretary of War anymore.
He was Vice President from 1825 to 1832.
Oh my God, were we insane? We were, of course, but we justified the insanity with biblical passages and with the examples of the Greeks and Romans.
And this is another sad part of our history. We actually use the Bible to justify slavery because Jesus did say, if you are a slave or a master, treat your slave well. Jesus never directly necessarily said, don't have slaves, which is true, but there's a lot of evidence in the New Testament to suggest that it's still an evil. But they would try to justify it using the scripture, saying, well, God wants us to have slaves, it's totally fine. And then they would go to the Greeks and Romans and say, well, look at the Greeks and Romans, they were the leaders of the free worlds and they had slaves, why can't we? So they were trying to find any kind of moral justification they could to keep this going. Very sad.
With outright racism, arguing that black people were inherently inferior to whites, and that not to keep them in slavery would upset the natural order of things, a worldview popularized millennia ago by my nemesis, Aristotle.
Yeah, and to go along with this, I can't remember the name of the quote, and it's not science, but it was considered a science back then, where essentially, if you studied the brain or skull of a person, you could tell what their intellect was. And so a lot of people would use this justification of, well, a Negro's skull was different from a white's skull, and so they were naturally more subservient. They were meant to be slaves, meant to be servants, whereas the whites were meant to be dominant. That's an actual thing that we believed for a while. So yeah, it's kind of messed up when you look at it. I can't remember the name of that, what that was called.
I hate Aristotle. You know what defenders of Aristotle always say? He was the first person to identify dolphins. Well, okay. Dolphin identifier. Yes, that is what he should be remembered for. He's a terrible philosopher. Here's the truth about slavery. It was coerced labor that relied upon intimidation and brutality and dehumanization. And this wasn't just a cultural system, it was a legal one. I mean, Louisiana law proclaimed that a slave owes his master a respect without bounds and an absolute obedience. The signal feature of slaves' lives was work. I mean, conditions and tasks varied, but all slaves labored usually from sunup to sundown and almost always without any pay. Most slaves worked in agriculture on plantations, and conditions were different depending on which crops were grown. Like slaves on the rice plantations of South Carolina had terrible working conditions, but they labored under the task system, which meant that once they had completed their allotted daily work, they would have time to do other things. So lest you imagine this is like how we have work and leisure time, bear in mind that they were owned and treated as property. On cotton plantation, most slaves worked in gangs, usually under the control of an overseer or another slave who was called a driver. This was back-breaking work done in the southern sun and humidity, and so it's not surprising that whippings or the threat of them were often necessary to get slaves to work. It's easy enough to talk about the brutality of slave discipline, but it can be difficult to internalize it. Like, you look at these pictures, but because you've seen them over and over again, they don't have the power they once might. The pictures can tell a story about cruelty, but they don't necessarily communicate how arbitrary it all was, as, for example, in this story told by a woman who was a slave as a young girl. The overseer went to my father one morning and said, "Bob, I'm gonna whip you this morning." Daddy said, "I ain't done nothing." And he said, "I know it. I'm gonna whip you to keep you from doing nothing." And he hit him with that cowhide. You know, it would cut the blood out of you with every lick if they hit you hard. That brutality, the whippings, the brandings, the rape, was real, and it was intentional, because in order for slavery to function, slaves had to be dehumanized. This enabled slaveholders to rationalize what they were doing, and it was hoped to reduce slaves to the animal property that is implied by the term chattel slavery. So the idea was that slaveholders wouldn't think of their slaves as human, and slaves wouldn't think of themselves as human. But it didn't work. Let's go to the thought bubble. Slaves' resistance to their dehumanization took many forms, but the primary way was by forming families. Family was a refuge for slaves and a source of dignity that masters recognized and sought to stifle. A paternalistic slave owner named Bennett H. Barrow wrote in his Rules for the Highland Plantation, "No rule that I have stated is of more importance than that relating to Negroes marrying outside of the plantation. It creates a feeling of independence." Most slaves did marry, usually for life, and when possible, slaves grew up in two-parent households. Single-parent households were common, though, as a result of one parent being sold. In the Upper South, where the economy was shifting from tobacco to different, less labor-intensive cash crops, the sale of slaves was common. Perhaps 1/3 of slave marriages in states like Virginia were broken up by sale. Religion was also an important part of life in slavery. While masters wanted their slaves to learn the parts of the Bible that talked about being happy in bondage, slave worship tended to focus on the stories of Exodus, where Moses brought the slaves out of bondage, or biblical heroes who overcame great odds like Daniel and David. And although most slaves were forbidden to learn to read and write, many did anyway, and some became preachers. Slave preachers were often very charismatic leaders, and they roused the suspicion of slave owners, and not without reason. Two of the most important slave uprisings in the South were led by preachers. Thanks, thought bubble. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? We're doing 2 set pieces in a row? All right. The rules here are simple. I wanted to reshoot that, but Stan said no. I guess the author of the mystery document, if I am wrong, I get shot with the shot pen. Since I have been in the Queen's dominions, I have been well contented. Yes, well contented for sure. Man is as God intended he should be. That is, all are born free and equal. This is a wholesome law, not like the Southern laws, which puts man made in the image of God on level with brutes. Oh, what will become of the people, and where will they stand in the day of judgment? Would that the 5th verse of the 3rd chapter of Malachi were written as with a bar of iron and the point of a diamond upon every oppressor's heart, that they might repent of this evil and let the oppressed go free. Alright, it's definitely a preacher, because only preachers have read Malachi. Probably African American, probably not someone from the South. I'm going to guess that it is Richard Allen, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Yes, it's Joseph Tabor, and Stan just pointed out to me that I should have known it was Joseph Tabor, because it starts out, "Since I have been in the Queen's dominions." He was in Canada. He escaped slavery to Canada, the Queen's dominions. All right, Canadians, I blame you for this, although thank you for abolishing slavery decades before we did. So the mystery document shows one of the primary ways that slaves resisted their oppression by running away. Although some slaves, like Joseph Tabor, escaped slavery for good by running away to northern free states or even to Canada, where they wouldn't have to worry fugitive slave laws, even more slaves ran away temporarily, hiding out in the woods or the swamps and eventually returning. No one knows exactly how many slaves escaped to freedom, but the best estimate is that 1,000 or so a year made the journey north. Most fugitive slaves were young men, but the most famous runaway has been hanging out behind me all day long, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman escaped to Philadelphia at the age of 29, and over the course of her life, she made about 20 trips back to Maryland to help friends and relatives make the journey north on the Underground Railroad. But a more dramatic form of resistance to slavery was actual armed rebellion, which was attempted. Now, individuals sometimes took matters into their own hands and beat or even killed their white overseers or masters, like Bob, the guy who received the arbitrary beating, responded to it by killing his overseer with a hoe. But that said, large-scale slave uprisings were relatively rare. The four most famous ones all took place in a 35-year period at the beginning of the 19th century. Gabriel's rebellion in 1800, which we talked about before, was discovered before he was able to carry out his plot. Then in 1811, a group of slaves uproot from New Orleans seized cane knives and guns and marched on the city before militia stopped them. And in 1822, Denmark Vesey, a former slave who had purchased his freedom, may have organized a plot to destroy Charleston, South Carolina. I say may have because the evidence against him is disputed and comes from a trial that was not fair. But regardless, the end result of that trial is that he was executed, as were 34 slaves. So the most successful slave rebellion, at least in the sense that they actually killed some people, was Nat Turner's in August 1831. Turner was a preacher, and with a group of about 80 slaves, he marched from farm to farm in Southampton County, Virginia, killing the inhabitants, most of whom were women and children, because the men were attending a religious revival meeting in North Carolina. Turner and 17 other rebels were captured and executed, but not before they struck terror into the hearts of whites all across the American South. Virginia's response was to make slavery worse, passing even harsher laws that forbade slaves from preaching and prohibited teaching them to read. Other slave states followed Virginia's lead, and by the 1830s, slaves...
Pause on that. Why would that be one of the new stipulations, is preventing slaves from teaching them to read?
Because, if I'm not mistaken, Frederick Douglass said this, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But because the more knowledge they know, the more likely they are to understand just how bad their situation is.
Exactly. The more that they can learn, the more ideas they get in their head, the more they actually realize, wait a minute, something is very wrong here, we should not be in this situation. And that would create potentially more what? Rebellion, exactly. So again, this was another strategy that farmers and Southerners used, that they basically tried to cut off education for the slaves, because if they are kept in the state of dumb animals, then they are dumb animals, even though they weren't actually, but that was the mindset. So.
Had grown, if anything, more harsh. So this shows that large-scale armed resistance was, Django Unchained aside, not just suicidal, but also a threat to loved ones and really to all slaves. But it is hugely important to emphasize that slaves did resist their oppression. Sometimes this meant taking up arms, but usually it meant more subtle forms of resistance, like intentional work slowdowns, or sabotaging equipment, or pretending not to understand instructions. And most importantly, in the face of systematic legal and cultural degradation, they reaffirmed their humanity through family and through faith. Why is this so important? Because too often in America, we still talk about slaves as if they failed to rise up, when in fact, rising up would not have made life better for them or for their families. The truth is, sometimes carving out that identity as a human being in a social order that is constantly seeking to dehumanize you is the most powerful form of resistance. Refusing to become the chattel that their masters believed them to be is what made slavery untenable and the Civil War inevitable. So make no mistake, slaves fought back. And in the end, they won. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Owen.
We can turn the lights back on for now, because I did want to talk about this just a little bit before we got into Jeopardy. So, how did this... Hold up. How did this make you feel, watching this kind of history?
Well, it's definitely one of the sadder parts of our history. I love Harriet Tubman's story. That's definitely one of my favorite stories from this time period. Mm-hmm. But it's just all of the stories that you hear. It truly makes you sad of how they take such good literature and stuff and prove that slavery is bad, and they turn it for their own purposes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, another thing to keep in mind, that even, not just being over here, but even being brought over here, the slaves were treated horribly. There's a movie called Amistad, and I think Amazing Grace covers this too, where essentially the way that the slaves would be brought in was these ships would be layered with floors, and the slaves would literally be laid down on top of each other, stacked. And many of them died, diseases were shared. I mean, it was absolutely just inhumane conditions. And again, it's very easy for us today to look at things like World War II and look at Hitler and Stalin and say, oh, look at these guys were terrible people. But the simple fact is, in our history, we're not free of guilt ourselves, at least in terms of our former our ancestors. Now, luckily, we don't do that, but that's because we've learned from it. But yeah, this is a tough one to always talk about. It is part of our history. We can't erase it. We can't ignore it. There was even a war fought over it where numerous lives were lost, and it's probably the most casualties in any American war then or since. And that whole thing was fought over slavery. Obviously all the problems are fixed now, though, right? No. Even today, we're still seeing the remnants of the hatred on both sides, the prejudice on both sides. It's still around. It still affects black communities today. That's still a thing. It's crazy what history will do and how long it'll stick around, because it's been over a century and we're still here. All right. So with that being said, any questions on that or curiosities about it? Yeah, okay. I know it's not fun to stomach, but we got to get through that. We're gonna do our Jeopardy game. We'll do 3 teams. We'll try to get as much as we can. Let me check our time here, make sure that I'm not running over time. Let's see, this is kind of. Oh, no, we're good. We've got a half hour. All right. So I think since we have an even number today, we can make it more of a competition. So let's switch teams around with this time. Let's see. Maria, you switch with Hannah. So Abby, you switch with Celicia. Celicia, excuse me. Yeah, I think we can mix it up enough for this round. See what happens.
Don't judge my drawing.
Alright, so we got Team 1, Team 2, and Team 3 over here. So I think I did Team 1 the first time that we did this. So let's start from right to left this time and do Team 3 first. No pressure.
Go ahead. Sure. Can you hold the lecture 300?
Lecture 300? Alright. The movement that said all humans would eventually find their way to salvation was called this.
The Enlightenment?
Not quite. So, universalism. Remember, you can lose points for getting wrong.
Yeah.
Universalism is actually still a few points today. It began around the Second Great Awakening. Now, the difference between the First and Second Great Awakening was essentially the Second Great Awakening was just not as big a deal as the first one. There were several branches that kind of sprung from that. I think it was the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses that sprang from the Second Great Awakening. I think a few other sub-ones did as well. But yeah, so Universalism was another one that did. And essentially, it was a form of Christianity, but not really, where it was essentially, well, everyone's eventually going to go to heven and figure out who God is in their own way. It's like, well, it's not quite what Christianity teaches, but okay. Alright, so let's make it Team 2.
Let's do true or false 200.
Alright, true or false 200. A group that arguably erupted from anti-Catholic sentiment was called the Know Nothing Party.
False.
You have to raise your hand if you're going to answer.
False.
You think false, okay. It's true.
It's so ridiculous that it wouldn't be false.
Yeah, but there's an actual party. So. Alright, Team 1. Let's go.
No points back. I just better. Yeah. True or false?
Okay, which one?
300.
300? Alright. Even during the War of 1812, the various Indian cultures wanted nothing more than diplomacy and mutual respect with their white neighbors. They routinely took the moral high road and never committed any atrocities against their enemies. I gotta get Tim. Yeah, he had it up for a while. Yeah, it's false. Absolutely false. And this is one of the things I do want to talk about, not only the War of 1812, but the Trail of Tears and all that, is no side was 100% the victims or 100% the bad guys. And that's the way to look at it is, did we commit atrocities? Absolutely we did. Did various Indian tribes commit atrocities? Absolutely they did. It's never usually 100% right or wrong in these instances. Okay, so Team 2, get to pick.
Let's do famous Americans 200.
Famous Americans 200. This man believed so much in the wider ramifications of standardization and interchangeable parts and machinery that he called it the American system.
Oh, Oh, what's his name? No. Never mind, I don't remember it.
Anyone else?
I'm not gonna get it. I'm not gonna get it wrong.
I'm gonna skip this one. Or? Oh wait, what?
Andrew Jackson.
Let's see. No, Eli Whitney, the guy who invented the cotton gin. It's okay. I'd rather you guys can try it. It's okay. So, okay. So let's see. Mix up team 3. Go ahead and pick one.
Let's go with true or false 500.
True or false? 500. Andrew Jackson had no intention of complying with the terms of the Treaty of Ghent regarding the Indian tribes.
Wait, false.
False?
I feel like it's true, isn't it?
It's true. Yeah, he's not compromising in any way. So, alrighty, team 2.
Let's do true or false 400.
True or false 400. According to the text, America moved from being a small and fledgling ex-colony to a major nation after winning the War of 1812. False.
I can't get enough fast enough.
False. You're right. It was actually the settlement of the Mississippi Valley. Because as y'all remember, the War of 1812 didn't really do much one way or the other. It was the settlement of the Mississippi Valley. So for sure. Alrighty, team 2.
Let's do wordplay 100.
Okay, wordplay 100. After 1821, thousands of this ethnic group began to apply for American immigration due most immediately to a certain crop failure. You say potato, I say potato. Wordplay, so it's a bit of a joke in there. Think of which?
Irish?
The Irish.
I should have known that one.
That's right.
I should
I know that one, bro.
What did he say?
I've let you favorite them.
Alrighty, so team 1.
True or false 100.
True or false 100? The Fort Mims massacre was not a real massacre and certainly involved no brutality on the part of the Creeks.
False.
Yeah.
Okay.
And see, this is where we see this, again, we see this kind of gray area because technically speaking, in history, the Cherokee actually kicked the Creek out of their homes and massacred many of them. The Creek did this to other tribes, we kicked the Cherokee out. There was this constant cycle of brutality on multiple fronts. So even the Creeks were not free of atrocities. Alrighty, so team 1. Starting to build it back up. We can do this.
Where's second place?
100 by 100.
Lecture 200.
Lecture 200. Jackson's perceived relationship with the nation could be described as this familial relation.
The father.
The father. Yep. Father. Yeah. Even though he was arguably a very harsh, cruel, and probably not fair father, but a father of the nation technically is a somewhat apt description. Alright, team 2.
Lecture 100.
Lecture 100. Old Hickory was the nickname of this U.S. president.
It's
Andrew
Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson. You notice a pattern in this Jeopardy game with Andrew Jackson?
Oh, Hickory.
Yeah.
Hickory.
Yeah.
So
He's been featured quite a bit. Alright, team 2, you get to pick again. Y'all are at a pretty good lead, so.
Like 400 more than
yeah, let's go.
Lecture 400?
It's not gonna make us lose either.
This movement that said humans were inherently good and there existed a single unified God who operated along the lines of reason. This also is a movement that is still around today. I actually had a professor who was part of this movement. Very weird individual. I like that. There's like 16 movements. Yeah, there's more like hundreds, but yeah, basically. And they're all variations of each other in some form or fashion.
I have no idea.
Okay, skip this one? Alright, so this one is called Unitarianism. Yeah. You can actually Yeah, and you can still see that the Unitarian Church is still around. And essentially, the overall viewpoint is that, you know, Jesus, Buddha, all these other deities, they're all essentially the same God that we're all going to come across eventually. And it's kind of hard to work that around when you think about it. It's like, yeah, but there were several of these religions that put an absolute, there is only one, or there's only these, or there's only that. I mean, either they're lying or they're true. You can't have it both, so.
The sad fact is the one I get right is the one I don't say.
Well, you gotta go for it. You risk losing the points. All right, let's mix it up and give Team 1 a chance to pick.
Religion and movements 200.
Religion and movements 200. I think we're staying away from that for the longest time. Georgetown was America's first university for this religious group. And I believe it's still around today. It's not as hard as you think. Nobody? Anyone want to guess?
It's way too
The Catholics.
Oh, okay.
I was trying to give you all a hint because the song I was humming was the fight song for Notre Dame, which is a Catholic song. Yeah, I tried.
Sorry, not Notre Dame.
Oh no, I just know the song. I was trying to give you all a hint, like it's like Notre Dame. Okay, so Team 3 will let you pick. So we're going on the cycle.
Lecture 500.
Lecture 500. When the Founding Fathers created the United States, they intended it to be this type of government with some democratic aspects.
Republic?
Yes. A republic. Pretty good.
I thought that was too easy to guess. I was like,
No.
Republican?
I kind of didn't give you the answer way a little early in the class, that's why, but otherwise it would have been a little bit more challenging. Okay, because a lot of people say democracy, and it's like, actually, Ben Franklin and the other Founding Fathers were like, no, we do not want a pure democracy. Absolutely not. Basically because people, when they're all together, are stupid. So, yeah, it's essentially the idea of mob rule is not a good one and has failed multiple times. You don't want to give complete power to the people. Okay, so let's see, Team 1 got that right, so.
Famous Americans 300.
Famous Americans 300. This U.S. president actively supported the repatriation of slaves as a solution to a particular institution. If you're wondering what that means, repatriation means sending some of the slaves back to their homeland. I mean, y'all are pretty far ahead.
Is it Andrew Jackson?
You gotta raise your hand. Sorry, I didn't.
No,
Let's see. No, it's actually James Monroe. Not Andrew Jackson.
I was getting
That was the only president I could think of. I was like,
That's okay, it makes the game more exciting. Alrighty, so Team 2, you get to pick this time.
Famous Americans 400.
Okay, Famous Americans 400. This woman sect leader considered herself the female principal in Christ.
I don't know.
Not as well known, if it makes you feel better. Maybe it was, you never know. It's not Hillary Clinton.
That would be hilarious.
It's good.
Yeah, I don't think any of us know.
Okay, so skip. Alright. Mother Ann Lee.
No.
Not a very well known historical figure. At least not in general circles. Alright, so Team 1. What'd you pick?
Religion and movements 300.
Okay, Religion and Movements 300. In the 1840s, the largest Christian denomination in America was this group.
Is it the Catholics?
Let's see. It's the Methodists.
Oh, there's so many religions.
We're Methodists. They are still a very large group today. Okay, so Team 3.
Pretty sure we're all tied.
No.
Team 1 and Team 2 are. Famous Americans, 500. These two presidents became wealthy through the early 19th century boom in land speculation. These two were largely responsible for the events leading to the Trail of Tears.
Wait, if it's leading.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say Andrew Jackson.
There's two.
And I feel like I know the names, but I can't. I just did this like 2 days ago.
Mm-hmm. So what I'll do is if you get one of them right, but you don't get the other one right, I won't take away points, but you don't get points either. So, you guess one.
Can I read them?
Huh?
Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson.
Nope, Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. If you remember me talking about Van Buren, so nobody gets points. If you remember talking about Van Buren, a lot of people blame Andrew Jackson for the Trail of Tears, and while he was largely responsible for setting it up, it was Martin Van Buren who officially said, get him out. So
What also made it challenge Jackson is that he had a future or a past of fighting with the
Yes.
Native Americans.
Yeah.
And I did an essay last year. It was like it made him look really bad, especially when the Trail of Tears came, because he fought so many duels with.
he did, and on top of that, I did mention that it started with Jefferson, but not so much the official removal. It was just the sentiment to think of westward expansion, removing the natives, really began with Jefferson's presidency. But the two who were probably the most directly responsible were Jackson and Van Buren. Van Buren, in my opinion, being the most directly, because he could have just as easily said, "No, we're going to fight this." And he was like, "Nope, get him out." So yeah. Alrighty, team 2, let y'all pick. That was a good guess, since you were almost on it. So,
Famous Americans 100.
Famous Americans 100. Henry Clay was a womanizer, compromiser, abolitionist, dancer, and gambler. Well, he actually wasn't this. This is included in the list. He wasn't one of these things, for sure.
Compromiser?
Dang it! I literally just whispered it.
He was not an abolitionist. He was yeah. Yeah. By 100, so don't get too full of yourself. All right, so let's go with team 1. Pick one.
Religion and movements 100.
Oh gosh, you guys are such low riskers. I don't even win this, you're gonna die. The territory of Utah was essentially developed by this religious sect. They are still around today, and they are heavily populated in the state of Utah. Mormons. That's right.
Never mind.
Yeah.
We're tied.
Alright, team 2, your pick now.
Wordplay 200?
Wordplay 200, alright. Let's go. Henry Clay engineered the This Compromise of 1820. Guessed he loved company.
Gracie.
Nope, this is a, you have to, what compromise? It's a wordplay, so there's like a joke or a clue in the wordplay. Henry Clay engineered the This Compromise of 1820. Guess he loved company.
This?
Nobody knows this saying. That's surprising. You want to skip it?
I can't really know it, but I'm probably going to beat myself up for not knowing this.
The Missouri Compromise, or Misery. Misery loves company. It's a saying. Misery loves company. Because if you're miserable, you want company. So, or you want other people to be miserable along with you. So, it's an
I've
easy.
never heard that.
I'm really surprised that nobody got that.
I mean, at first phrase,
Oh, like Virginia.
Especially considering it's the Missouri Compromise. That should have been even easier. Alright, let's see. Team 3, I think, because we were doing the cycle, and Team 2 got it right, but then we had done Team 1. So, Team 3, you get to pick. Wordplay 300. This individual saw South Carolina and Massachusetts on extreme ends of the slavery question and believed that they were responsible for the eventual explosion of the Civil War. Guess we shouldn't have taken them for granted.
That makes rare, isn't it?
probably.
Okay. There's something.
You will definitely hear a lot more about this individual during the Civil War.
What's his name? His first name's Grant or last name's Grant. I don't remember his.
Okay, I'll give it to you because you're right. Yes. Ulysses S.
Ulysses Grant. Okay.
She had her hand up.
I mean, makes sense though.
Yeah.
Who's never remembers Ulysses?
Ulysses, such a good name.
Seriously thinking 2008.
Alright, so team 1, it is your pick. This is still a close game. Anybody could
Let's
win.
do religion and movements 400.
Okay, religion and movements 400. This movement in the Trans-Appalachian frontier, such as Cambridge, Kentucky, can be characterized as driven by subjective emotionalism. And again, very prominent today. We call it progressive Christianity in a lot of ways.
Oh.
I don't know, it's so hard because there's so many.
It's a bit of a bigger movement. It's not so much like a very specific, small thing.
I don't know.
You want to skip this one?
If you want, that you force it to go.
I don't know.
Oh.
I don't want to go all myself.
I would make a sarcastic comment, but
Yeah.
I'm not getting forced to get off.
Alright, so this one is the Second Great Awakening. It's the most
Way more
Yeah.
sense.
all the different forms of it. So, alrighty, let's give team 2 a chance.
Wordplay 400.
Wordplay 400. Here we go. Lyman Beecher believed that the religious and political destiny of the nation would be decided in the American this. So go there, young man.
It's his last name, young man, or something.
Wait, what's it? Is he West?
It is West in the American West.
Thank you.
Yep.
The only reason I thought was I was thinking that only sounds like something from a cowboy movie. I was like,
Yeah, it was a very famous expression used to essentially it was to create the excitement of the frontier. Go west, young man. You know, go make your fortune. So it was also alrighty. So I got 2 more. Let's see. So I'll flip them up. Let's do the religion movements 500.
Ready? Rick's.
Alright, Kellogg's Corn Flakes was a vegetarian food developed by this group to meet religious dietary regulations.
I don't know. I didn't know Kellogg's Corn Flakes was still around.
Yep, they were early cereal.
I'm reading about this.
There's too many movies with like restrictions like
This might surprise you if you've ever eaten Kellogg's. You've kind of given money to this group.
I don't even know what the religious group is.
It's not like the
I don't think it is.
Yeah.
Put 3 guesses in.
I mean, do we want to skip this one too?
Yes.
Okay. Seventh-day
Yeah.
Adventists. Seventh-day Adventists.
Because
True story. Alright, and then finally, wordplay 500, so we'll do that one last. And you might as well guess this one because it's either make or break, unless you're the ones who are ahead. These were the radical Indians who fought against the Americans during the War of 1812, committing murders regularly on their way to England, Canada. They must have liked chewing cinnamon-flavored gum next to the river.
Wait.
Yeah. This was the best clue I could give. It's the closest thing.
What's flavored gum?
Indian?
What's the cinnamon flavored gum brand?
Need more to it. It's a very specific tribe. It's just 500 questions, so this one's tough.
We don't have
I don't need this.
the chances of them getting it right are going to be like 50-50.
5 of them. And I really can't remember. Maybe, I don't know.
There's so much that we're covering.
I can't remember all of them. There's like 5 major groups that I can't remember all the names.
So do we want to just give Team 2 the win? Or
No.
like you might as well guess, because I mean if you don't, you automatically lost, so
I still just think Indians. I have no idea. The Seminoles?
Raise your hand if you
Seminoles?
Yeah.
not quite. In this case, the Red Stick Creeks. So you were on the Red Stick Creeks.
I was close.
You were very close. Oh, I'll give you half points, you still lost. Alright. So yeah, that's right. Yeah. Alright, so make sure you guys study. I think that's all we have the time for today. So, 1 second. Let me pause that.